Hello and welcome back to my Tarot to the Nines video series, where we're going to be looking today at how you can find what your number is. That is what your tarot birth card or life path number is. So if you're following this series and you want to look into how your birth date numerologically relates to the tarot, then this is the video to watch. And we're going to look at how you can find your tarot birth date number, which relates to one of the first 9 major arcana or first 10 major arcana cards. And then we're going to look at 2 systems. We're going to look at one which is slightly simpler than the other, which I'm about to go through now. And then in the second part of the video, we'll look at one that's a bit more complicated, but is the one that I'm going to be using mainly through this series. So it's the one that I tend to use if I'm doing this kind of work. And then we're going to look as a third thing at finding, at choosing the number that might be appropriate for you by looking at a personality typing system called the Enneagram, which is a bit more involved in terms of actually finding the number. But basically that's 3 different ways of discovering what your tarot birth card number or numbers is. So this way that I'm about to go through now, I will call birth card pairs. I hope you can see the whole of the board. Let me just tilt that up a bit. So tarot birth card pairs, and this is a method that was developed and certainly popularised anyway by Ruth Ann and Wald Amberstone of the Tarot School, and it's been written about in this book by 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙊𝙆, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Tarot, Birth Cards and You, Keys to Empowering Yourself, which is published by Schiffer. This book goes into quite a great deal of detail, in fact, of how this system works. But let me just run through the calculation with you so you can see how it works and how you can calculate, excuse me, dropping my pens, calculate your own numbers. So, very simple calculation, you do it like a sum. So you take the month of your birth and you write it like that in 2 digits. So if your birth month is October, you'd write 10. If it's November, you'd write 11. If it's June, you'd write 06. Then you put the date of your birth, again in the same way. And then the first 2 digits of the year, which for most of us, of course, will be either 19 or 20. And then the last 2 digits of your year. And what that will give you is an addition. You add them all up like that, and you'll either get a 2-digit or a 3-digit number. If you get a 2-digit number, you do Pythagorean reduction, which I mentioned in my previous video, where you add the 2 digits together long ways. If you get a 3-digit number, you treat the first 2 digits as a single number and the last digit as a separate number. So you add the first 2 to the second, and that will give you a result. And the result will either be a single digit or it will be a double digit. Now if it's a single digit and it's between 1 and 9, then that tells you what your first card is. And the second card, and in one case the third card, is implied. So you look at what the other card would reduce to that single number. Or you might get a double digit, in which case you then add those 2 numbers together using Pythagorean reduction, and so you'll have potentially 2 different cards. So let me just show you what I mean, and we'll use this date as an example. September the 26th, 1948. Let me just tilt this round a bit so you can see a bit more clearly. Is that clearer? I'm not sure it is. Anyway, September the 26th, 1948, which is actually the birth date of Olivia NewtonJohn. And I've chosen Olivia NewtonJohn because I mentioned her in one of my most recent videos, which was the one about 100 questions that nobody ever asks, and I told my exciting story of stealing, or a friend stealing, the sign that reserved Olivia Newton-John's place at the re-premiere of Grease in 1998, and I still have that sign, and I will look it out and I'll show it to you one day. But that's what made me think of Olivia Newton-John, and I know her birth date, so I thought I'd use this as an example. So I hope my maths is correct. So she was born on the 26th of September, 1948. So what you do is you take the month of her birth, 09, and the date of her birth, 26, and the first part of the year, 19, the second part of the year, 1948, and you add them all up and you get 102. That's a 3-digit number. So we treat the first 2 digits as a single number and then the second digit as a single number, and we add them together. 10 plus 2 is 12. So now we have number 12 in the major arcana, the Hanged Man. But 12 is a double number digit, double digit. So we add, using Pythagorean reduction, 1 plus 2, and we get number 3, the Empress. So the way that the Tarot School describes this, and the way that Bonnie describes it in her book, is effectively what we have now is a pair of birth cards which numerologically are related and which act almost like a kind of gateway through which Olivia Newton-John's life lessons and path and destiny, etc., are mediated. And the book goes into some detail about what this looks like. So, you know, actually, if I have a quick look at the section, I should have really noted the page before coming on camera, but let me just have a quick look, and I can show you what is said in this book. It's a very good book if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So we have the Hangman and the Empress. I hope that's probably too bright because of the light. I'll read it to you. So it gives you the astrological associations, Hangman being water, the Empress being Venus. Key words for the Hangman: surrender, acceptance, recognize the patterns that bind us and need to consider options, etc., etc. The Empress: nurturing, mothering, creativity, fertility, grounding of energy. The theme: learning to surrender and accept life and the ability to give and receive love and compassion. The Hangman and the Empress represent the two aspects of the gateway into a 12/3 lifetime. The Hangman is ruled by the element of water, placing focus on emotions and accepting the light and shadow of life. We need to take a time out to review where we are in the cycle that is life. The Empress is ruled by Venus, placing the focus on creativity, love and nurturing. With the Empress, we see the need for the practical application of one's skills and abilities. The Empress listens to her intuition to know where to place her attention and energy. And then it goes into detail about how a 12/3 individual would empower themselves. Interestingly, finding their unique voice, very appropriate for a singer. And then it talks about the Hangman and the kind of questions that the Hangman might ask, and the Empress and the kind of questions that the Empress might ask. And then it has a series of affirmations that relate to this pairing. It has a journeying process with the Hangman and a journeying process with the Empress as well. So there's a lot of rich detail in here that actually helps. And then it has a summary, and I'll read you the summary just so you get a sense of the kind of information that this kind of calculation can give us if we're following this system. The Hangman and the Empress both ask the seeker to look at where they are in life. The Hangman is moving away from the details of the physical world. He is looking for enlightenment and inner wisdom. The Empress is intimately involved with the minute details of life, protecting those in her realm, nurturing the life around her, and appreciating the abundance in her world. Now, obviously, I think that most of this stuff relates and should be engaged with in an interior way. So it's not for me to say what another person's path is, even knowing what their cards are, but it can give some broad associations. And just here are a couple of things I noticed just from what I've read so far, and being a fan of Olivia Newton-John. I know that apart from being a very successful singer, Olivia Newton-John has become a very vocal advocate for two broad areas that don't necessarily relate to her singing career. For a number of years she was very involved in ecological and environmental campaigning and awareness raising, and so there's something there about looking after the abundance and the natural environment. And she's also obviously been an advocate for sort of working through breast cancer, and she's developed her own hospital and in Australia to nurture and look after people who are journeying with cancer. So there's something there about protecting people in her realm, appreciating the abundance in her world, etc., etc. And you know, the Hangman taking time out, you know, certainly going on a cancer journey, having had this successful career, I'm sure will have made her look at things in a new way, and she said as much herself. So there's something there that one can relate to some of those life events, but really the only way that this could work properly is if Olivia Newton-John was here now and I could speak to her about it, and sadly she's not, so we can't do that. But just imagine if you had this pairing and you were hearing this, you would be able to relate some of these themes to your own life, and that's what this is about. That's what this whole system is about. So it also goes into the gifts and abilities and ways of working with gifts, abilities and challenges if you're on that path. Okay, so that's the broad how you do it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, I'm going to wipe this slate clean, and I'm going to set out for you what the other birth card pairings are, so you can work out for yourself what your birth card pairing is if you're using this system. So, back in a moment. And as if by magic, we now have all of the birth card pairs up on the board, and I'm going to talk you through them so you get a sense of you know, which one relates to you if you've done the calculation. So basically, if you got your initial sum down to a single digit, 1 to 9, then you will be one of these first 9 pairs, because the double digit is implied. You've got the single digit and then the double digit is implied by you being there. Now, hang on, let me just adjust the light. I don't want you to get blinded by me moving. I'm just adjusting the light lock. I hope that's better. Is that better? Anyway, you'll tell me if it's not. So, so that's implied. If you got a double digit, then you will be one of these, of all of these, and I'll show you how that works. So if you were a 10 reducing to 1, you're Wheel of Fortune and Magician. If you're 11 reducing to 2, you're Justice and the High Priestess. If you're a 12 reducing to 3, like Olivia NewtonJohn was, you would be Hanged Man and Empress. I put a little ONJ there to remind us that that was ONJ's pairing. 13 reducing to 4 becomes Death and the Emperor. 14 reducing to 5 becomes Temperance and the Hierophant. 15 reducing to 6 becomes the Devil and the Lovers. 16 reducing to 7 becomes the Tower and the Chariot. And this little BCC there gives you the clue that I am in that pairing. Now, when I use this method, which is the tarot school method, I get to a 16 and then a 7. If I use the other method, which is Mary Greer's tarot constellations method, I don't get a 16 in my calculation, I go straight to 7. And that's relevant because in the other system, you don't have tarot pairs, you have an initial card and then you have another card or more than one card which have slightly different meanings. So they are different, they're similar but different systems. So this is the simpler one, but the one that I'm going to talk about next is the one that I tend to use because I think it's got a bit more depth and interest to it. But this is a very good system as well, and certainly very good if you are numerologically challenged like I am. So yeah, so that's me, Tower and Chariot. 17 reduces to 18, that's Star and Strength. 18 reduces to 9, that's the Moon and Hermit. Now, so that's our first 9 pairings. There's another 3. And the reason I've highlighted these is they're a bit different. So if you get to 19, that gives you 3 cards. So you don't have a pairing, you have a triplicity of cards. So, and that's because it's the only one that it happened in. 19 reduces to 10, which reduces again to 1. So you've got the Sun, the Wheel of Fortune and the Magician. You're not a Wheel of Fortune and Magician, which would be a 10-1. You are a 19-10-1, which is a Sun, Wheel of Fortune and Magician. So although some of the cards, 2 of the cards are the same, it's got a slightly different context, and the book explains that. And so too with the next 2. So here we've got 20 reducing to 2, which gives you Judgment and the High Priestess, which has got similarities to, but also some differences to Justice reducing to the High Priestess. And we've got 21, the World reducing to 3, which is the World reducing to the Empress. So again, you know, Olivia Newton-John was not a World Empress. She was a Hanged Man Empress. She was a 12-3, not a 21-3. And although there are obvious similarities because you've got the Empress in both, there are also some differences because in one there's a Hanged Man and in the other there's the World, and they have different symbolic meanings. So you are dealing with different sets of symbols. Now, as I said before, the way that the Tarot School talks about this is to see these cards, these pairings, or in that case the triplicity, as being like a gateway through which you walk and through which your life lessons and destiny and your life path will flow in some way, and both of these cards will influence you. And the book that I mentioned goes into that in great detail, so I recommend that. So that is the simpler system, and now we're going to talk about the slightly more complicated one. So I will be back again with a nice clean board with some other calculations on it, and we'll do the Tarot Constellations numerological reduction system to see what your numbers are in that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the second way of calculating your tarot birth cards, and this is using the method that's outlined by Mary K. Greer in her excellent book, which was originally published as Tarot Constellations and is now called, republished and revised, and now is called Who Are You in the Tarot? Discover your birth cards and year cards and uncover your destiny. And the way that she urges us to calculate the cards is a bit more traditionally numerological. So this is the way that numerologists tend to calculate numbers in a numerology reading. So the calculation here is, again, you're adding your month, your day, and your year of birth, but you don't split the year as we did before into two different chunks and then add them up. You start with your month, your day, and the whole number of your year, and you sum them together, and you will get a 4-digit number. Let's call it A, B, C, D. Then you add Pythagorean reduction, A plus B plus C plus D. That will give you a result. That will give you a number. That number will either be 22 or lower, in which case you are into the 22 cards of the major arcana. And that means that that number you reach, if it's 22 or lower, that first number is what we call the personality card, and we'll come on to that in a second. You then reduce that, oh, I'm missing a bracket there, then you reduce that to find out what the soul card is, and we'll talk about what soul cards are in a second. Or, if it's not 22 or lower, obviously it's going to be 23 or higher. Now 23 is outside of the major arcana, so in order to get into the major arcana, which is where all of our tarot constellations are going to be happening, we need to reduce it again. So we take that number, whatever it is, and we need to reduce it to 22 or less, and that will then give us the first personality number. Now, if you do this, you're either going to get, if you go through all of this, you're either going to get a single digit number that takes you straight into the major arcana. So in my case, when I do this, I sum my things, my day, month and year together. I get a 4-digit number, I add that 4-digit number together, and what I get is 7. That's what comes out. So I am a chariot for my personality and my soul. So my personality and soul cards are the chariot. Another example, here we have Mick Jagger, sticking with the rock star. I don't mean I'm a rock star, I mean, you know, we talked about Olivia Newton-John a moment ago, so let's stick with pop stars. Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones, born July 26th, 1943, sorry. So we put July, which is 7, the 26th, which is 26, and then his year, 1943. We sum that together, we get 1976. 1 plus 9 plus 7 plus 6 equals 23. So it's 23 or higher. So what we need to do is reduce it to 22 or less. We reduce it and boom, we're into the major arcana. 2 plus 3 is 5. So he is a Hierophant. And he is a Hierophant, like I'm a chariot, he is a Hierophant. Here's another example, Barack Obama, born August the 4th, 1961. 08, 04, 1961, added together gives you 1973. 1 plus 9 plus 7 plus 3, 20. Boom, we're into the major arcana. So his first card, his personality card, is Judgment. But we can reduce further. We can add 2 and 0 together and we get 2. So he is Judgment, High Priestess. So his personality card is Judgment and his soul card is High Priestess. So that's the broad calculation. You can do this now and you will find out what your personality and soul cards are, and they might be the same or they might be different. There is another element, and that is the shadow card, or sometimes called the hidden factor card, or sometimes called the teacher card. And that basically relates to the cards that have not, that are within the major arcana, that have not appeared in your numerological calculation yet. So obviously with Mick Jagger, he's a 5, he's a Hierophant 5, but he is going to have the hidden factor card of what adds up to 5, 1 plus 4 in the major arcana, Temperance. So his hidden factor card, his shadow card, or a teacher card, depending on how you want to describe it, is Temperance. In my case, my hidden factor card, well, my number is 7, personality and soul. My hidden factor card is the Tower. I had to think then for a minute, is the Tower. 1 plus 6, that's 7. So that's how it works. So I'm going to clean the board again, and I'm going to show you what the tarot constellations are, what the various permutations are, so that you can see which tarot constellation you belong to. So again, we will clean the board and be back in a moment. Okay, as if by magic we're back again and we have the tarot constellations written up on the board. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about how this relates to what number you might be. As I mentioned before, if you land straight on a single digit within the major arcana, 1 to 9, then your personality and soul card is the same. In my case it was a 7, so my personality and my soul are both 7s, and my hidden factor card is a 16, because that's the one card that reduces to 7 that has not been part of my calculation, so that's the hidden factor card. Marilyn Monroe, incidentally, I can't remember her exact birth date, but her calculation resulted in a 16 first, then a 7. So her personality was 16, her soul card was 7, and she's got no hidden factor cards. Some people have got 2 hidden factor cards, so if you do your calculation and you end up straight away with a 3, then your personality and your soul card are both the Empress, and you've got 2 hidden factor cards. You've got the hidden factor of the Hanged Man and the hidden factor of the World. So that's kind of an interesting little aside. If you are somebody who starts off with a 19, you also don't have a hidden factor card, because if you land on 19, that reduces to 10, and then that reduces to 1. So you could argue there that you have actually got 2 personality cards. So you've got the Sun, and you've got the Wheel of Fortune, and then your soul card is the Magician. So there are various different permutations, and one of the things that Mary K. Greer, well, I should tell you by the way what the definitions are. So your personality card relates to your characteristics and your essential nature. Your soul card relates to your purpose and what needs to be expressed in your life. So this is an oversimplification, but if you're somebody who has got a personality and soul card which are the same, then that means really that you are a person whose characteristics and essential nature are strongly related to what your purpose is and how you need to express yourself in the world. So you have got a set of qualities which are intrinsic to what you're trying to bring out in the world. If you have got a different personality and soul card, then it's a little bit more complicated than that. Your hidden factor card, and it's sometimes known as the shadow card or the teacher card, relates to exactly what you would expect in terms of the shadow. It's what you fear, it's what you reject, what you're not aware of, what you don't see, and what you must learn in this life. So to have a hidden factor card tells you something about the kind of lessons that life might give you. So in my case, lessons of the Tower, lessons of destructuring, lessons of disruption. So it's kind of interesting to go into that kind of analysis. Also, of course, if you look at the 9 constellations, you will find that they also relate to the 10 pip cards. So the first constellation is the 1s and the 10s, because 10s reduced to 1, 2 obviously relates to 2, 3s to 3s, 4 to 4, etc., all the way to 9s. Now what these cards relate to are your allies and obstacles along the way. And it's very simple really to look at it as, if you look at, in my case, the 7s, there are a couple of the 7s in the minor arcana which are somewhat more positive than the other 2. So the 2 positive ones are your allies, and your 2, sorry, I think I just heard Maya coming up the stairs, and your 2 negative ones are your challenges, the kind of things that might trip you up. So broadly, that is how the system in this book works. So if you follow that calculation, you will be able to work out your personality, your soul card, your hidden card if you have them, and your allies and your obstacles. So you now have, using the numerological calculation, everything you need to know about how to find your birth cards. I will add one more thing into the discussion, and it's something I've mentioned in a previous video, and I'm just throwing this out there for your edification and your consideration. And that is, obviously these calculations are based on adding together date of birth, month of birth, and year of birth. Now, some time ago I had the thought and did an experiment, because I thought, well, you know, if you're looking at an astrological reading, obviously, which is another form of symbolic divination using calculations like this, you know, based on your birth date. Not calculations exactly like this, but using your birth data as a way of pinpointing you symbolically in the everything. the mystery of life. But what astrologers tell us is that it's more important than anything to have, or most important to have, your time of birth as well as your place of birth, because that helps to really pinpoint you. If you only know your date of birth, but you don't know your time of birth, then there's a limit to what information you can be given. You can't, for example, accurately calculate what your ascendant is in your birth chart. So this then occurred to me, and I wondered, why is it that we don't use birth time in this calculation? So as well as adding your year, your month and the date, why don't you also add the hours and the minutes in to see what happens and to see what that gives you? Now, there is a reason, of course, for not doing it. And one of the reasons is it's more likely that there's going to be a mistake with your time of birth than anything else. It's unlikely there's going to be a mistake on your birth certificate about the date of birth. But it's possible that the time of birth won't be 100% accurate. So, you know, you're born and then somebody, after all the kind of birth has happened, makes a note of, oh, Brian was born at that particular time. But how do we know that in the time it took them to look away from me having been born to the clock, that the minute hand didn't shift one place? And of course 1 minute out would change the calculation. It would shift you into a different constellation. So there is a logic behind not using birth time. However, some numerologists state that the important information that you should be using when you're doing a numerological calculation is the information that is on your birth certificate, even if it isn't 100% accurate. So by that token, if you have got a birth certificate and it has got your birth time on it, then it may be legitimate to use that birth time in your calculation. And just to give you an example of how that works, if I don't use my birth time in my calculation, as I say, I come out as a 7, which is the Chariot and the Tower. If I do add in my birth time, the hours and the minutes, I come out as a 9, the Hermit and the Moon. Now, what's interesting about that for me is that I definitely resonate with the Chariot and the Tower. My public life, my early life, and my, if you like, the personality dynamics that I have built for myself and have drawn out of myself and expressed in order to move forward in my life, and particularly in my career, but also not just my career, also my personal life, have very much involved me drawing on Chariot and Tower characteristics, if you like. But if I'm really honest, if I was to be asked how I see myself internally, the Brian that exists inside, a bit more intimately with myself, then I would place myself closer to the Hermit and the Moon. So it's interesting to me that if I take that more detailed birth data, it feels to me as though it's homing in on something that's a bit more intrinsic to me. And the way that I like to think about it now is that I am fitting under the umbrella of the Chariot constellation, and within that umbrella there's the whole totality of the constellations again, and I sit within the Hermit constellation. So I'm kind of, that's my subset. Now that's just my thinking. I haven't done any experiments on this, and I'd be interested to know if you do pursue this, whether it is of any interest. But here's another interesting thing, and this relates to what I'm going to talk about in a moment. When I do testing, and I've done a number of tests to determine which Enneagram type I am, and the Enneagram types are 1 to 9, I think I'm a 9. Now I say I think because I've not done a formal Enneagram course or training, and the Enneagram is not one of these personality types where you just fill in some questionnaires and it tells you, you know, you are this. It's much more complicated than that. You can do questionnaires which can give an indication, but Enneagram tutors and trainers recommend that actually the best way of determining whether what type you are is to talk to other people and to be observed in talking to other people by people who understand the Enneagram, and to refine your analysis of what type you are by doing that. So it's important, I think, to do it properly, but at this stage in my process with the Enneagram, I am fairly sure that I am a 9, as sure as I can be anyway at this time, and it's been validated in a couple of tests, but that might change. So it's kind of interesting to me that when I add my birth time in I come out as a 9 and the Enneagram is telling me I'm a 9 as well. So what is all this about the Enneagram? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I'm going to clear the board again. I'm going to have a glass of water because I'm beginning to get a little bit hoarse, and we are going to talk briefly, because I can't really say an awful lot about this at this stage. We're going to talk about the Enneagram personality typing system. So back in a moment. So this is a brief interlude. I'm just jumping in here in between segments to say something about why it's worth looking at this issue of connections between tarot constellations, the numbers in tarot. Because one of the things that I'm sure that many of you will be thinking, even if you are someone who is very interested in tarot and thinks that tarot has something to offer, is you might feel a little bit, as I have done in the past, that actually it's a step too far to start saying, well, your birth date can be numerologically reduced to a number, and that number relates to a tarot card, and that means that that tarot card is related somehow to you and to the meaning of your life and so on. And I get that. I absolutely understand that. And the thing is, if you are working within these fields of divination and the mantic arts, if you like, then you are going to come up against some of these very unfathomable and seemingly nonsensical correlations, if indeed they relate and exist at all. So I just want to throw out a couple of ideas for you, because I've spoken in a previous video about the fact that I am very comfortable with the idea that just taking tarot as an example, and a tarot reading, one of the explanations for tarot is that the cards that come up in a reading are in fact meaningful, that the cards actually are somehow connected to your situation, and that's why tarot reading works, because the cards you get are the cards that you need to see, and they really mean something, and it's all very connected and relevant. But I'm completely comfortable with the idea that actually in a tarot reading it's possible that we get completely unrelated cards, completely random cards, and actually the meaning, the importance of the meaning is created in our perception of the cards. Now I'm completely comfortable with that. I don't feel any desire to have it proven to me that the tarot cards are somehow connected in some way, or that there is a kind of psychological or mystical relevance within a tarot reading. But I'm not saying that there isn't. I'm just saying that I don't need that to be proven in order for me to feel that tarot works. And it may well be that it's similar when it comes to the phenomenon of numerology, which is what this basically is about. If you're looking at your life path in relation to tarot, you are doing a numerological calculation. What you are saying is that your birth date, and reducing your birth date to a single digit or a double digit within the major arcana, 0 to 22, or 1 to 22 cards, 0 to 21, you are saying that there is effectively some kind of relevant meaning and connection. If you're saying that, then you are engaging in a numerological practice. And you know, I know that some people will be completely comfortable with that, and others will think, well, that's just a step too far. So where I come at it from, and I mentioned before that it's important to maintain this kind of magical mindset, this metaphysical mindset, is that, you know, we live in a mysterious universe. We live in a very strange place. The fact that we're even here, it sometimes surprises me that people, you know, kind of, you know, get kind of exercised and aerated about the idea that people believe in or think some strange things and unverifiable things, and, you know, believe religions and all kinds of stuff like that. It surprises me that that disturbs people, because I find myself thinking, actually, if you sit and think about it for a moment, then the whole thing is really bizarre. The fact that we're even here is very strange, and if you sit and think about it long enough, then you probably will begin to perceive that as well. It's a very strange scenario that life exists, the world exists, and I don't even mean that life exists because there's been, you know, evolution and all that kind of stuff. I get that in terms of, you know, in reality there is that sequence of events that leads to this moment now, but the fact that there are even such things as moments that can be put into sequence, and that can lead, one thing can lead to another, and there's this kind of duality in the world, and there's an up, there's a down, there's a dark, there's a light, and all that kind of stuff. The whole thing is just really strange. So so for me, the idea that there is meaningful connection between things within this wonderful, strange, mysterious universe just, you know, isn't all that odd. in my mind. And that, of course, relates to the principle that Jung spoke about of synchronicity, the idea that there is or can be meaningful coincidence between unrelated things. But I want to introduce a couple of other concepts to you, which I think are kind of relevant to this. One is the concept of pareidolia, which is the seeing of a familiar pattern where none exists. Now that's the kind of thing that if you look out, for example, into your garden and you're looking at a tree and you suddenly see a face in the tree, and it's to do with the way that the leaves are arranged, and there isn't a face in the tree, but your brain sees a pattern, and in that pattern it recognizes the face. So there's not a face there. There's not the familiar pattern that you think is there, but your brain thinks that it is. That's pareidolia. That is seeing a familiar pattern where none exists. And it may well be that when we do our birth card calculation and we find out what constellation we are in, and we start looking at that constellation and we think, well, that's my constellation, it could well be that there isn't a meaningful pattern that relates to us, but we're perceiving one, we're seeing one, because our brain is processing it that way. And I'm comfortable with that as well, as long as the information that we get from it is helpful to us in our lives. So there's that. And then there's the concept of apophenia, where we can perceive connections between unrelated things. And that's where, this is sometimes used as a description for the beginning of some psychotic episodes and schizophrenia and so on, where, you know, completely unrelated things that don't even look a bit like a pattern, like kind of leaves, just begin to make sense to somebody. And, you know, I'm mentioning that simply because I'm indicating that the human capacity to find meaning is huge. And, you know, we can find meaning where meaning exists, where meaning has been constructed, or where there are recognized connections. But we can also find meaning where there are coincidences that don't seem to be connected in any way other than there appears to be a connection and a meaning between them. And it can go all the way through to, you know, finding meaning where really there is no connection. So I'm mentioning these things just to make it clear to you that I am very open-minded about why it might be that looking at tarot birth cards is a useful thing to do, and that we can get something from it as tarot readers. I've mentioned before, if you don't want to go into that, if you just want to look at tarot from the point of view of numbers and reading the numbers in a reading, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to do any of the kind of tarot birth card stuff that I'm describing in this video. But if you are interested, if you think there is something in it, I am just saying to you that I'm giving you permission to not feel that you need to know, one, that it works, two, even that you need to agree that it does work. All that I think you need to be interested in is it helpful? Can it give you some relevant, useful information that you can use in your life? And it is entirely possible that, you know, it wouldn't matter what your number was. So in other words, it might not matter what your birthday is. It might be that if you end up with any number, then going into that constellation would be useful in terms of what it might sort of bring up in your consciousness. The way that I look at the tarot is very much that each of the 78 cards are facets of this amazing jewel that is the tarot, and any one of the facets can take us into the entirety of the jewel. Or another analogy is that the tarot is this hologram, and, you know, like a hologram, if you shine a light through any part of a hologram, the whole thing appears. So too with tarot. It doesn't matter which card you pull out. Potentially, it might be that any card would be relevant in any situation, because if you engage with that card and you go into it deeply and you ask yourself questions stimulated by the card and you use it to stimulate your thinking, you can have a very relevant reading. And it might be the same with the tarot constellations. So I am completely open-minded about that. That's why I'm doing this video series. I don't feel the need to prove it to myself or anyone else that it works or is real. I'm interested in, is it relevant? Is it relevant? Can it be helpful? And in my experience, the relevance and the helpfulness comes not from numbers on a page or images on a card. The relevance comes from your engagement with the symbolic system that is tarot. And in that sense, I think that whether you're engaging with the numbers in a reading or you're engaging with Tarot Life Path, it is possible to find great relevance and great meaning and great enjoyment. And I hope that that is what we'll be able to do in this series. So with that said, back to the main video. And again, as if by magic, we now have the Enneagram up on the board. And I know that you're not going to be able to read all of my writing here, partly because some of it is very small, and secondly because it's pretty messy, and that's partly because I'm a bit tired now. I've been filming for some time and it's late, and yes, I'm finding it a bit more difficult to write clearly. So don't worry about that, because I'm going to talk you through this. I just wanted to throw it up so that you have a visual of the Enneagram and we can talk a bit about what it is. I do want to just stress the Enneagram side of the Tarot to the 9 series is really the optional extra. I'm not suggesting that it's a major part of the series, partly because the Enneagram doesn't necessarily fit exactly with the Tarot constellations that we are going to be talking about. But the reason I wanted to include it is because I've been reading this very interesting book called The Fool's Excellent Adventure, A Hero's Journey Through the Enneagram and Tarot by Susan Rhodes, which is it's actually a rather ambitious book, because what it tries to do, and I think it does pretty well, is link together the tarot obviously and the Enneagram, and also the hero's journey that we hear about from Joseph Campbell, and it talks about the different paths which relate to the different types on the Enneagram and the different tarot constellations. So what Susan Rhodes does is she draws a clear link between the 9 tarot constellations and the 9 Enneagram types. Not everyone would agree that those are a natural match, but she argues the case very strongly and very compellingly. So I thought it was worth mentioning, because if you are interested in this, then it's certainly something you could look into. If you know your Enneagram type, then obviously when we come to talk about your number in this series, then you can see whether what we say about your number in relation to tarot relates in any way to your Enneagram type, or if you think it does. Now, as I mentioned, I am not an expert in the Enneagram. I'm still in the very early stages of learning about it. So what I'm going to give you now is a very brief overview, and it's very much my kind of perspective on it, rather than some kind of definitive guide. So I won't. What I'll try and do is I'll find an article that says a bit about the history of the Enneagram and how it all fits together and how it was developed as a personality typing system. The Enneagram symbol itself is a lot older than that, and Gurdjieff used the Enneagram and described the Enneagram in his work long before it was a personality typing system. So this is a fairly late innovation. So I will talk a bit about, I'll link an article below that gives you a bit of the history of the Enneagram, but just to talk a little bit about the principle of it and also what the personality types mean. And I've drawn much of this from this book called Understanding the Enneagram by Don Richard Riso, who's written a number of books on the Enneagram, and are well worth seeking out. So he didn't originate the system, but he certainly refined it and expanded it and done a good job of explaining it. So very broadly speaking, one of the things that I find fascinating about the Enneagram is that it works on the principle. Now, you know from my previous videos, if you've watched my previous videos, that I'm interested in non-duality. And I see very clear links between the concept of non-duality, the idea that everything is one, that the kind of separation we experience in our lives is real in this real world, but at some fundamental level, at some transcendent level, is illusory, and that actually at some very profound level we are indeed all one, and we are one with everything that we perceive as separate. But that's getting a bit metaphysical. But what interests me about the Enneagram is that one way of looking at the Enneagram is that the reason human beings fall into one of the 9 types is that we have broadly 9 different ways of forgetting that we are one. And in fact, there's a book called Facets of Unity, which is written by, the author's name is 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎. And that book takes a very metaphysical, spiritual look at the Enneagram, and Facets of Unity works on the basis that each of the Enneagram types is a facet of a unified whole. And actually we are all whole, we just don't think that we are, and we don't think that we are in different ways, and it's the way that we perceive ourselves to be separate that determines our Enneagram type. That's one explanation. Excuse me, I'm not saying that that's the definitive one, but that's one explanation, and it's certainly one that I find very interesting and very fascinating, and that appeals to me and makes sense to me. So, drawing from this book, Understanding the Enneagram, I have put down the 9 Enneagram types and some of their characteristics. So I'm just going to quickly run through them with you so that you're aware of them. Excuse me, and I am getting a bit hoarse now, as you can tell. So, type number 1 is what they call the reformer, and each of the types has got, oh, and I've forgotten to add in, you'll notice that each of these others have got this little red, if I can find my red pen, I have this little red cloud which has in it a description of the type. So let me just find in this book the description again so I can add it on. Oh yes, so this person is, oh, wrong side of the pen. So this is the idealistic orderly. Idealistic orderly. And that doesn't look like idealistic and orderly. Perfectionistic intolerant person. So these are just descriptions, and you'll see that there's a mix of things in there, not all of them complementary. That's one of the things about the Enneagram. Very many personality type systems, and you'll know some of this, those of you who've followed things like Myers-Briggs and any kind of personality typing system. Very often what people do is when they find out what type they are, they look straight at the positive characteristics and they go, oh yes, you know, I'm an INFJ, they're so rare, that's me, they're so rare and they are so intuitive and they're able to do all these marvellous things and blah 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 blah. The Enneagram works slightly differently and actually works on, as I mentioned, on the basis of this kind of separation, this kind of forgetting, this kind of lack of unity, and so it actually has in it some it points out some what could be perceived as negative traits of the personality types, and in fact some Enneagram teachers emphasize that and others don't. But somebody once said to me that one of the things about the Enneagram is that really you start to know your type when you look at the description and you kind of go, oh, and you feel a little bit like, yeah, that hits the nail on the head of where I'm a little bit, you know, not quite as balanced as I could be. So some of these descriptions include rather negative traits. So the reformer, idealistic, orderly, perfectionistic, intolerant. The reformer's fear is of condemnation. Their vice is self-righteous anger, and their virtue is wisdom. The helper is the concerned, helpful, possessive, manipulative person. Their fear is being unloved. Their vice is vainglory, that kind of puffed upness. Their virtue is disinterested charity, so they can be kind of selfless and you know, giving without any desire for return at their best. So each of the Enneagram types can be at its best or its worst. It can be healthy, it can be unhealthy, it can work at different levels of operation. Number 3 is the motivator, the assured, ambitious, narcissistic, psychopathic person. That does not mean that everyone who's a 3 type is a psychopath. It just means that they've got the potential to have that tendency. Their fear is of rejection. Their vice is of sloth in self-development. That's their kind of thing that they are likely to fall into if they're not very healthy. And their virtue is proper, real self-love, healthy self-love. Number 4 is the artist, the creative, individualistic, introverted, depressive person. They fear being inadequate. Their vice is envy. Their virtue is emotional balance. Number 5 is the thinker. They're perceptive, analytic, eccentric and paranoid. That's the type of person they can be. Their fear is being overwhelmed, and their vice is avarice. Their virtue is understanding. Number 6, the loyalist. They are likable, loyal, dependable and masochistic. I think that says masochistic. That's the kind of person they can be. Their fear is being abandoned. Their vice is sloth in self-reliance, so they are likely to be lazy about depending upon themselves. And their virtue, when they're at their best, is courage. Number 7 is the generalist, the accomplished, extroverted, excessive, manic person. Their fear is of deprivation, their vice is gluttony, and their virtue is gratitude. Now that's interesting to me because in the tarot constellations, if I go with just my birth date, I am a 7, chariot. So if the numbers match up, and Susan Rose's book argues that they do, then I would be on that basis a generalist. And I can see a little bit of that in myself, but I'll come back to that because there are a couple of others that are stronger, and they are actually the two I'm going to talk about now. So the leader is powerful, expansive, dictatorial and destructive. That's their cluster of qualities. Their fear is of submission, of submitting to others. Their vice is lust, and their virtue is magnanimity. So when they're at their best, they can be very magnanimous. And the number 9 is the peacemaker, peaceful, reassuring, passive and repressed person. Their fear is of separation. Their vice is self-forgetting, so forgetting themselves and almost kind of drifting off. And their virtue is patience. Now, the reason I mentioned being interested in these is that everyone, once they've identified their types, they have one of these types, they also have 2 wings to the type. So if you're a 1, you have a 9 wing and a 2 wing, which means that you can move a little bit around within that arc. If you're a 3, you have a 2 wing and a 4 wing. If you're a 9, you have an 8 wing and a 1 wing. One wing of your 2 wings is always stronger. And the reason that's interesting to me is I've mentioned that I come out, when I look at the Enneagram typing systems that I've used, I tend to come out as a 9. And I can see a lot of the 9 in myself. Other people have told me, and nobody can tell you what your Enneagram type is, you have to work it out for yourself, but you can do it in discussion. And in discussion with some people who have studied the Enneagram in some depth, they have said that they are surprised to hear that I'm a 9, because they would have thought that I was an 8, but then it's possible that I'm a 9 with a strong 8 wing. Although of course it might also be possible that I'm an 8 with a strong 9 wing. And if I'm an 8, then it might mean that I have a 7 wing as well. So that's kind of interesting to me that, you know, there's a kind of a cluster around there that might relate to me, and of course that's the kind of cluster around which I center in my tarot birth card. Now there may be no connection and it might not be relevant, but it's kind of interesting. And it's interesting that when I do my birth time, in the tarot calculation, I come out as a 9. So there are other dynamics that you can look at within the Enneagram. So each of the types moves to what these lines indicate directions of travel, which I won't go into now, so that if you are a 9 then and you behave in a particular way, then you tend to be more like a 3 or a 6 depending on how you are operating. So that's enough on that for now, I think. I just wanted to give you an overview, let you know about it. At some point in this series I am going to talk about resources, so I'll look at some of the books that I've already mentioned in a bit more detail, and I'll also talk about some other books that you can tap into, including, and there's a range of Enneagram books that are worth looking at and that tell you a lot. It's a very rich, detailed, interesting, and I think very potentially very helpful system. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it and learning more about it with you as we go through this series. So in this video I have covered how to calculate your numbers in the tarot, so your birth card, your life path numbers, and we looked at it in 2 ways. We did the slightly simpler way of the Tarot Schools version as outlined in this book, and the slightly more complicated way, and I think probably a bit more interesting and useful for our purposes, the Who Are You in the Tarot method from Mary Greer. And we also talked about the Enneagram. So within all of that, you should be able to say now that you have got a cluster of cards that are relevant to you, and it may be that you just pick one number from the Enneagram, but now you have got enough information to be able to enter this series with me as we go through the cards number by number by number, and we look in depth at each of the tarot constellations, how they relate to, how the cards within each of the tarot constellations relate to each other, how they work in readings, how they work in your life, and just generally how they work symbolically within the tarot. So until next time, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful. Please do comment below. If you've got any questions about any of the things that I've mentioned, please put them below and I'll do my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'm sure somebody else who's watching and viewing and commenting will be able to answer them for you. So I'll see you all again very soon. Take care everyone. Bye.